7-year-old Cortney Clayton was a regular at the M System food store in Stamford, Texas. She and her older brother Nick would get some spare change and walk less than a block to the convenience store to purchase sodas pretty frequently, often enough that the employees knew the kids on site. On Friday, September 2nd, 1988, Courtney and Nick set off to buy sodas, but they didn't enter the store at the same time. Nick returned home, but Courtney did not. 7 months later, a hunter stumbled across Courtney's remains. Due to the scarcity of physical evidence and the time that passed between her disappearance and the recovery of her skeletal remains, Cortney Clayton's case remains unsolved 37 years after the fact. So her file sits in a box in the basement. Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In the last 50 years, the U.S. has had nearly 1 million homicides, and since then, over 250,000 cases sit in a box in a basement where all hopes for justice go to die. In 1996, someone shot my uncle Leon Laurellis, changing my life forever and leaving a devastating hole in my heart, and his case remains unsolved. Join me and my wife Leah as we shed light on these forgotten victims, their life, the loved ones they left behind, the evidence, and the theories of who committed these crimes, leaving communities in fear and leaving families without answers. Support our effort to change the justice system through the Homicide Families Victims' Rights Act, as we hope to make a difference with our audience as we remember the victims and demand justice. In 1996, my world was shattered when my uncle Leon Laurellis was shot execution-style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and co-workers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention, in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting, collecting dust in a box in a basement. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement Podcast and Justice for Leon Laurellis. And now you can also find us on YouTube.
1988 saw the end of the Iran-Iraq War and the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. Benazir Bhutto became the first female prime minister of Pakistan and the first woman to lead a Muslim-majority country. George H.W. Bush beat Michael Dukakis in the U.S. presidential election, and the Piper Alpha oil rig exploded in the North Sea, killing 167 employees. Pop culture in 1988 was fun. Electronic music was gaining popularity. Pop music ruled as Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Whitney Houston dominated sales and charts. TV was equal parts sitcom and nostalgia. the Die Hard franchise made its debut, and clothing started to evolve from cropped, tailored, and neatly cuffed to baggy and loose. The number one song on the Billboard Hot 100 the week of September 2nd, 1988 was Monkey by George Michael, followed by Elton John, Chicago, Guns N' Roses, and Robert Palmer. The Wanderer by Eddie Rabbitt sat atop the country charts. A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 was number one at the box office, though Who Framed Roger Rabbit would be the top grossing film of 1988. And The Cardinal of the Kremlin by Tom Clancy was number one on the New York Times bestseller list for fiction. Looking at the list, 1988 was an amazing year for popular fiction. You had Anne Rice, James Michener, Tom Wolfe, Stephen King, and Robert Ludlum. Good stuff. Stamford, Texas is in the north-central part of the state, about 207 miles west of Dallas and 147 miles east of Lubbock. The history of Stamford is actually kind of cool. Svante Magnus Svensson, an early ranching magnate and widely considered to be the first Swedish immigrant to Texas, donated the land to the state, and the city of Stamford was officially incorporated in 1900. The railroad entered the town shortly thereafter. An airfield opened as an Army Air Corps training facility during World War II, temporarily boosting the local economy, but railroad traffic gradually decreased over the following decades. Today, the local economy generally depends on cotton production, the healthcare industry, and the local school district. The Texas Cowboy Reunion is held in Stamford every year, and it is home to an impressive Western Heritage Museum. Today, Stamford has a population of about 2,800, and in 1988, the number would have been closer to 4,100.
Cortney Lynn Clayton was born on October 16, 1980, in Eastland County, Texas, to Stan and Candace Clayton, who had moved from Southern California just 2 years earlier. At the time of her disappearance, she was a second grader at Oliver Elementary School in Stamford, Texas. Her family described her as well-loved, independent, and friendly, and she got along with her two brothers. She loved sports and thrived on competition of any kind. She was spirited enough that some of her teachers described her as, quote, a handful. Apparently, she liked talking during class. Like we mentioned before, Cortney liked to go to the M. System store just up the street to purchase sodas on her own. Her dad would give her 50 cents, and she'd skip, walk, or ride her bike the short distance to the shop to buy herself a little treat.
I remember when I was a kid, I'd do the same thing. There was a dry cleaner in one of my good friends' neighborhoods that also sold candy and baseball cards. And every so often, I'd take a few bucks from my mom and go buy a couple packs of Now and Laters or Jolly Ranchers.
So, on this particular evening, sometime before 9 p.m. on September the 2nd, 1988, which was also Cortney's second day of school, she took 50 cents from her dad and waited outside for her brother Nick to join her for the trip down the road to the convenience store. Cortney was given instructions from her father to wait, but Cortney apparently grew impatient and went ahead to buy her drink on her own. Nick had every intention of joining his sister. He just got a little sidetracked. He ran into a friend on his way to the store and stopped to chat. By the time Nick entered the convenience store, his sister had already paid for her drink and left, according to the cashier. The cashier was interviewed later on and said that Cortney didn't quite have enough money to cover her purchase. She was 4 cents short. The man behind her offered to cover the difference, but the cashier waved him off, knowing that Cortney was a regular and it wasn't all that big of a deal. According to witnesses, Cortney left the shop and headed toward her house, which was located just north of the convenience store. Cortney's brother Nick entered the store at 8:55 p.m. to buy his own soda, and the cashier informed him that his sister had already paid for her drink and left. Nick went home, but his sister had not yet arrived. Almost immediately, Cortney's parents knew something was amiss. Cortney, still only 7 years old at the time, was afraid of the dark, and it would be extremely strange for her to stay out after 9 p.m. voluntarily for that reason. Cortney's parents did a quick search of the neighboring streets, but when they failed to locate her, they went into panic mode and contacted the sheriff's office, who went into action immediately.
So deputies questioned the convenience store's employees and some other eyewitnesses to help construct a basic timeline and to give some boundaries for a search. Deputies found a near-full cup of soda, the same kind Cortney had purchased just a short while before, on the bumper of the store owner's vehicle in the parking lot. Investigators initially thought that the benign positioning of the soda probably meant that Cortney had encountered someone she knew. Law enforcement believed at the time that if this was a violent abduction, her soda would have been on the ground, or the cup would have been broken, torn apart, spilled, something like that. But I'm not so sure about this. Cortney was known to be friendly and polite, so even if a stranger had confronted her in the parking lot, she may well have just placed her drink on the nearby car's bumper. It still could have been a violent abduction in any case. Predators have a knack for putting their prey at ease, regardless of familiarity. I don't have a whole lot of information on any activity on law enforcement's part overnight, but there was still no sign of Cortney the following morning, Saturday, September 3rd. Law enforcement canvassed the neighborhood, airborne searches were conducted, and volunteers met up to look for clues around town and the surrounding area, but nobody found a thing. At this point, investigators began to theorize that Cortney had almost certainly been abducted, and that she was no longer in town. Surely by this time, someone would have seen or found something. It wasn't that big of a town.
The weekend passed. Monday came, and there was still no sign of Cortney. The FBI quickly got involved. Tips poured in, but they didn't result in any leads. Searches continued over the following days and weeks with the local police, several neighboring county sheriff's offices, state troopers, game wardens, Texas Rangers, the FBI, and hundreds of volunteers participating. They scoured the town, literally going door to door and block to block twice. They searched the nearby fields and wooded areas. They dragged the ponds in the area, and airborne searches continued. Nothing was found. Investigators continued interviewing neighbors, friends, family, and employees and customers at the convenience store, and they managed to tighten the timeline down a little more. A woman who was picking up her husband from across the street reported seeing Cortney outside of the store at 8:53 p.m. near a car with two male occupants. The witness said the car was a blue Ford Torino, and she claimed she saw the driver's side door open, and the driver was speaking to Cortney. That was it, though. No indication that the girl had been forced into the car or that she entered that particular vehicle at all. And we know from experience that eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable. Yes, this was a small town, but this interview took place weeks after the fact. Witnesses get details wrong. They misremember dates.
This particular witness volunteered to be hypnotized. She was able to describe the driver of the blue Torino to a sketch artist, but nothing ever came of that particular lead.
As the days, weeks, and months slipped by, Hopes of finding Cortney alive started to dim. Tips continued to trickle in. Similar, Smaller searches happened. Interviews continued, but no new leads were generated and no new evidence was found. Things took a devastating turn on March 27, 1989, when a hunter stumbled across a human skull in an open field in neighboring Shackleford County, about 50 miles from Cortney's hometown. The hunter called law enforcement, and they were able to recover a number of other human bones in the vicinity of the skull. The bones were small, and there weren't that many open cases of missing kids in the area. So investigators had a sinking feeling these might be the remains of Cortney Clayton. The identification process would be arduous and time-consuming, however. Normally, when skeletal remains are found, they are most easily identified through dental records. Cortney had never seen a dentist in her short life, so there were no x-rays to compare the skull to. She'd never had any significant injuries to her bones, so forensic scientists weren't able to make a comparison that way either. Eventually, it came down to hair. Investigators did find some human hair with the skeletal remains, and they compared it to samples taken from Cortney's hairbrush. Staff at the University of North Texas did a facial reconstruction using the recovered skull, and this combined with the hair samples and clothing found nearby that matched what she was wearing led investigators to conclude that the remains did belong to Clayton Cortney.
Due to the degree of decomposition of Cortney's remains, the medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death, but the case was reclassified as a homicide. By this point, tips had stopped coming in, and investigators hit the proverbial wall. Nothing at the scene provided any clues as to how Cortney got to Shackleford County. There wasn't any physical evidence linking her abduction to a specific person, and her remains were all skeletal at this point. There was simply no evidence or information to go on. Over the years, police did track down a few new leads. A pair of men in Shackleford County were suspected of trying to lure kids into their car. They had ties to the property where Cortney was found, but they passed polygraph examinations and were eliminated as suspects in the case. According to reports that we have access to, there's never been another suspect named publicly. There have been a few persons of interest, but we'll talk about one of those in particular here in just a minute. In 2016, artists updated the composite sketch of the man the eyewitness claimed to have seen speaking to Cortney in the convenience store parking lot in the hopes of jogging someone's memory or giving someone the courage to come forward after all these years. But nothing has come of that updated sketch to this point.
So, in this case, it's less a question of what happened to Cortney Clayton on that September afternoon in 1988, and more of a question of who took her. She was 7 years old, and though she was a little feisty and strong-willed, she was not rebellious or unhappy. She didn't run away. She didn't stay out later on purpose just to disobey her parents. She was afraid of the dark, and she was a good kid. The first theory is that someone lured her into their vehicle at the convenience store parking lot. Perhaps the man the eyewitness saw speaking to Cortney. Perhaps someone else. Authorities theorize that Cortney may have left with her abductor willingly because of the careful placement of her soda cup on the bumper of another vehicle. The thought process here was that if Cortney had been violently snatched, the cup would have been dropped on the ground or spilled. I can see why they thought this, but I don't think the fact that the cup was sitting on the car on that car bumper rules out the possibility that she was violently snatched. She could have set down the cup to tie her shoe or speak to someone nearby. She still could have been abducted quickly and violently. Could have been someone driving downtown, someone doing some day labor nearby, someone visiting people who lived in town.
I tend to side with the theory that this was someone passing through. Courtney was a target of opportunity for some scumbag who stopped to either troll for a victim or saw Courtney while making a pit stop at this particular store. There were, what did I say earlier, like 4,100 people in this town at the time? And I've seen many locals describe it as a place where everyone knows everyone else's business. So my personal feeling here is that this was someone not from the area. But we do have to consider all the alternatives. Do we think that Courtney could have been abducted by someone she knew?
I think that's always a possibility. It's not a very big town. It's possible that the person who took Courtney could have at least known of her, if they didn't know her in some way. It's possible that the person who took Courtney could have at least known of her if they didn't know her in some way. Courtney and her brothers kind of had a routine. They included regularly going to the M System store for a fountain drink. It is absolutely possible that a predator had their eye on the kids and chose a moment where Courtney was alone, either in the store or in the parking lot. I've seen people question the man in line behind Courtney who offered to cover the 4 cents she was short on her drink, but it seems that nothing ever really came of that. I think he was probably just trying to be kind. And in any case, the cashier waved him away and covered Courtney. It would be pretty bold of someone to interact with Courtney and the cashier with their face in full view of everyone inside the store and then kidnap her. We know Courtney made it outside the store. The cashier saw her leave. She was seen by at least one eyewitness in the parking lot, and her soda was found almost full on another vehicle's bumper. Could it have been a neighbor? Someone who worked at her school? An older kid? Another regular at the convenience store? Unfortunately, there's not enough information or evidence available to narrow down the choices. I tend to believe it was someone who at least knew who she was and maybe knew her routine. I see your point about the small town. It's a logical conclusion, but I tend to think it was someone who had their eye on her. I wonder if investigators tracked down anyone with ties to the area that maybe moved away pretty quickly after that, changed jobs, or changed their routine significantly. It would be interesting to find out.
Right. So obviously, Courtney was taken from the parking lot. And unfortunately, unless someone comes forward with new information or confesses, we may never know if she was lured into someone's vehicle or taken by force or anything else. What about those two men from Shackleford County that were thought to have been trying to lure kids into their car?
They were taken off the list, as it were, because they passed polygraph tests. Now, we've discussed polygraphs before. They are sketchy at best in terms of usefulness, in my opinion, but law enforcement during the 1980s did tend to rely on them more than they do today. In the mid 1980s, federal agencies started relying on polygraph tests to vet their employees, so this kind of became a standard test of trustworthiness amongst local law enforcement offices when they conducted investigations. There are some arguments in favor of their usefulness in eliminating suspects today, but I fear that maybe there might have been a tendency to put a little too much faith in polygraphs for a period of time. So I have no idea in depth. The two Shackleford County men were investigated. And my cynicism does give me pause here. Were they really treated as viable persons of interest? Or were investigators relying too much on the polygraphs? I don't know.
One person of interest I did want to discuss, we mentioned him a few minutes ago, was a convicted murderer named Doyle Lane. 8-year-old Bertha Martinez of Hays County, Texas, was abducted and murdered in 1980, and Doyle Lane confessed to and was later convicted of that murder in 1994. He was also questioned in the disappearance of 9-year-old Nancy Shoemaker from Wichita, Kansas. Doyle has a developmental disability and a long history of abuse and neglect, and he said his mother and stepfather made him kidnap Bertha Martinez. He also claimed that a friend of his forced him to participate in the abduction of Nancy Shoemaker. We won't get too deep into Doyle Lane's story here, but he is out on parole now, and it doesn't appear that he or his previous alleged accomplices had anything to do with Cortney's disappearance.
So that's unfortunately where this case stands today. If you have any information on the abduction and murder of 7-year-old Cortney Clayton on September 2nd, 1988, please call Crime Stoppers at 1-800-252-TIPS. That's 1-800-252-8477. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. If you or someone you know is a victim of crime, support is available. Call 855-4-VICTIM to speak with someone who can help you understand your rights and options. Visit victimconnect.org to learn more. We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network. Darkcast Network, the best in indie podcasts. Check out all the great shows at darkcastnetwork.com. If you think bringing unsolved cases is important, then please take a moment to rate and review our podcast. Also, please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcasts and Justice for Leon Laurellis. You can now also find us on YouTube. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor and subscribe. It would help so much, my lovelies. Also, please share this episode so we can bring awareness to these lesser-known cases so we can reach more people in hopes that someone who may know something will come forward. I'd also like to ask that you sign my petition for my Uncle Leon Laurellis' case to be reopened and reviewed with fresh eyes. And you can find our petition on change.org. This podcast has a bigger purpose than just providing information and entertainment. The Homicide Victims Families Rights Act is a bipartisan bill that was signed into law by Congress in 2021, and we want to see it put into action. This law establishes a systematic process for reviewing case files related to cold case murders. The focus is on providing a mechanism for the families and friends of murder victims to request a formal review of such cases. I also have a GoFundMe page to hire an attorney to help me get a copy of his autopsy that I have been denied for 27 years. You can find the GoFundMe by searching for Leon Laurellis. That's Laureles. But to get his body exhumed, to search for evidence that was not collected the first time around. We and other families and friends need assistance with getting FOIA requests. It blows our minds that so many murders occurred from 1976 to 1997 in Brownwood, Texas, under the watch of the same investigators responsible for handling Leon's case. We're going to look at all the unsolved murders in Brownwood and maybe even a few solved ones if it helps uncover what was happening in that era that left so many families devastated and a community living in fear. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators.